future trends, deep insights, industry leaders. This is the iGaming Next podcast with your host, Pierre, Lindh.
This podcast is brought to you by Pragmatic Solutions, the leading iGaming PAM platform with a modular approach, including many benefits like a fast, secure, and scalable API-based platform, integrated with all major third-party products and services. Make sure you head over to Pragmatic Solutions and join our smart thinking. This podcast is brought to you by the Bombay Experience, defining the future of luxury gaming experiences from digital through to physical, seamlessly, flawlessly, exclusively. Visit bombay.io.
And good afternoon, Stephen Myers, my Managing Director of Praxis Consulting. Great to have you on the podcast today. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm great. Thanks, Pierre. It's good to be on.
Brilliant. It's a pleasure to have you on here today, Stephen, because today we are going to talk about the topic that is near and dear to my heart, certainly. Here at iGaming Next, we have set out a vision statement, a mission to be a positive force for the iGaming industry. And today's topic is of ESG, which is obviously kind of ethical investing, which is becoming more and more relevant in the world today. And just as an introduction here to this concept, Stephen, of ESG, can you talk about what ESG stands for, what it means, and why it is so important for organizations today to consider their ESG strategy?
Yeah, I think when I'm talking to boards about this, the way I describe it is a sort of state of mind. It's really about the whole of the company's ethos, how to deliver a sustainable business model. Now, typically, particularly in iGaming, I don't think people have thought about that too much. And they need to more and more as we'll talk about investment and strategy and stuff like that. But I think if you look at the culture of a company, particularly in iGaming, there are a lot of younger people working in now, and there's pressure coming upwards from them because they want to work for a company that they believe is doing the right thing. And I think the mindset of the younger generation is very much on environment, social issues, whether the company governs itself in an appropriate and proper way. So all those things are just wrapped into it. It's sort of an extension of CSR, but it's much more than that. And it comes to fundamentally whether the company you work for is going to have a future or not, really, because if they don't abide by those rules moving forward, then it's going to be very difficult for investors in particular in those particular companies. We're already seeing, for example, certain pension companies won't even touch the industry. They have a mandate that says we will not invest in things like gambling, tobacco, alcohol, for example. And whilst I think gambling is not a sin stock. I'm from the industry and I firmly believe that. I firmly believe it's a lot of good people doing a lot of good things, but we have a reputational issue. And the perception is that it does not meet the highest standards from the public and politicians. And that's always going to be an issue and one we always struggle with.
Right. So that kind of leads me to the next question, which is from a public perception point of view, do you think the industry can ever become ESG compliant?
Well, compliance, a difficult word, I think, in terms of ESG, because it's more of a philosophy. I think there are elements you are compliant with. A lot of people there's a lot of talk about this greenwashing
because certain
situation.
pension funds and other funds will obviously have their own criteria, what they decide is compliant, right? So
Yeah, but that is very much a sort of box ticking exercise. What are your carbon emissions for the year? How many journeys do your staff make into work and out? And that's a tangible thing. They can measure that, and which is why a lot of people go to that as a starter. And we can do that as an industry for an iGaming industry in particular. That's pretty easy to do, unless you're heavily into crypto or something where you're using lots of energy. It's really quite easy because you've got a lot of people who are home based or are only in the office once a week. And it's easy to measure those things in terms of a carbon footprint and everything. But people like Blackstone have come out and said they're going to start measuring it in a more detailed way. And, certainly the fund managers are all over this, albeit not a lot of them in the gambling industry. So, the real issue for us in the gambling industry are the social and the governance issues. They tend to be the ones that have tripped us up and have caused all the reputational pain. So every time someone gets a regular settlement, not a fine, but a regulatory settlement, because they don't want a fine from a regulator, then that has a certain perception. It always gets reported pretty much in the same way and creates an issue for the industry. Every time you play to someone continually and should have shut them down for a period of time. Again, these things get far more exposure in some ways than they should do, but bad news always travels quicker than good news. And despite a lot of the efforts of the industry, a lot of the top tier companies in particular are doing some very good things that will hopefully filter further down and down into our gaming ecosystem.
Right. So organizations like Kindred, for example, which have set out this clear strategy to try to eliminate revenues from harmful gambling, essentially, is, for example, a good example here, right, of an ESG, a company is trying to take ESG serious.
Yeah, I always find this quite amusing because I'm always banging on about this Kindred thing, and my point always is that they may or may not get to zero problem gamblers by their set date or beyond, but I think it's an admirable goal. In terms of goal, in terms of they've set for themselves, you need to set that bar high, and I think what they're doing. Also, but I think the main thing for me with their approach is they're being transparent in terms of, so sometimes the figure goes up, sometimes it goes down, and that's what we want to see. We don't just want to see a gradual decline of that number. And then they're also making tweaks along the way as they refine the product, which I think is brilliant. I think Marius Catani's done a great job there with regards to it. Now, I laugh because they got really quite heavily criticised by the gambling press and others with regards to this for having a sort of grand ambition, if you like. So, but it's going to take top tier companies like that to really set the agenda and move along. And Entain, who are having some of their own headwinds at the moment, again, took the opportunity when they got a new chief exec to bring a new message and to look at how they were going to transform their business, led by ESG principles. And again, I think that's a very worthy cause, and one that, again, they've been criticised for in part. But basically, if you go into a company and are able to start changing those things, it will gain momentum. It will go further down the food chain. It will go across, importantly, to suppliers, because what we've seen with regulators in different jurisdictions is they go for the operator, and basically it could have been an action by one of their suppliers. It could have been an affiliate. It could have been a platform provider. It could have been someone else. But the operator faces the brunt of that. So guess what? They're now passing that requirement further and further down the supply chain, and only rightly so.
Yeah, fair enough. Taking a step back as well, taking a helicopter view over the industry as well, from an investment point of view. Do you feel that in order for the industry to be ESG friendly, or for individual organizations within the industry to be ESG friendly, is it a prerequisite that you need to eliminate harmful gambling as a starting point? Because again, you mentioned that the two important points that the industry usually falters over is the social and the governance, the S and G, whereas the industry often talks about the environmental part, where I hear a lot of organizations that are talking about being carbon neutral, so on and so forth. But you mentioned obviously kind of the greenwashing argument or the whitewashing argument, where basically this is kind of hiding the fact that the public sees the industry to be as a nefarious industry in the first place. So the question is still like for the industry to be seen as ESG friendly or ESG compliant, or whichever way you want to formulate it. Is this is it a non-starter if the industry cannot solve the gambling addiction issue?
I would argue it probably is. I don't see how you can have a sustainable industry if you're not dealing with the core issue that comes back to haunt you every single time. Responsible gambling is the biggest issue for the iGaming industry, and will continue to do so, because that is the reason people will, why you looked at as a less attractive investment, and why the industry has the reputation it has. One of the things I'm heavily involved in at the moment is trying to get an initiative with both regulators, operators and academics together, and others of the wider gaming ecosystem, that can agree some terms of reference for research methods that do use an evidence base to do that. Now, there are a number of issues with that. One is the fact that the industry, on an individual basis, is reluctant to share its data. Now, my view is that the industry probably doesn't have too much to fear in terms of academic research compared with the bad press and headlines it gets at the moment. It can't be any worse in many ways. But let's try and understand the fundamental issues. Let's understand how to do something about responsible gambling from an academic perspective that's agreed with regulators, politicians, the gaming ecosystem as a whole, so that at least there's a level playing field in terms of, rather than the rubbish that's spouted out all the time from both sides of the argument. So I think it's very, very important that we do that. And reputational issues are the ones that always come back. And responsible gambling is a source of that. If you've been taking money continuously from someone who doesn't want to be giving you money, or has got an issue, then you shouldn't be doing it. Fundamentally, is that the right thing to do? No. And what we don't understand, and one of the issues I've got with the regulators is they will give a regulatory settlement, but here in the UK, for example, that can appear nearly 2 years after the offence was committed. So, in the meantime, that company gets its act together, does lots of good work, and is showing real progress. And then the announcement comes nearly 2 years later, share price goes down, or investors get unhappy. Yeah. That seems to me, that's not a very fair process. They should at least go in and re-audit and look at the progress that's been made, and maybe have some mitigating structure to the fine that says, well, actually, we've reduced it because we've seen this improvement, and there's not the gap there was initially. So I think there's lots that can be done with that, but a number of regulators. So if you look at the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, they're all beginning to have this same sort of approach, which is I don't think is helpful to trying to resolve the issue. They're trying to punish the issue and play and pamper, if you like, to the politicians in some ways.
Right. It almost seems it's almost a perception game to some extent here, right? Where it takes a while for the public to understand the measures that the industry has taken of them, because if the public were aware of the strict AML and KYC checks that the operators are conducting to each and every customer in the regulated markets, perhaps the perception would be a little bit different from public view. It almost feels like the public is reacting to what the industry did a couple of years ago, say, but they are not understanding what the actual processes are today.
That's true, and also there is an element in there that there are certain factions that want to continue that debate. So, this is why I said the difficulties of trying to agree a level playing field for research is very difficult to do, because you've got such differing positions to start with regards to that. when my kids were younger, when we used to go to function at school or something, we'd talk to parents, and what do you do? I'm a lawyer. What do you do? I'm a doctor. And then what do you do? I work in the gambling industry. And literally everyone turned around and suddenly was interested. And that's a perception issue. It's driven by this debate, this negative connotation that exists almost everywhere with regards to gambling.
Absolutely, Stephen. If we zoom out again and compare ourselves to other stigmatized industries, say you mentioned tobacco, alcohol here earlier. I understand the point as well that perhaps our industry shouldn't be compared to these industries from our point of view, but from public perception, perhaps we are in the same box as these two industries. What are other stigmatized industries doing in order to safeguard their reputation? Is there anything that the gambling industry can learn from? Are they taking ESG serious? So on and so forth.
Yes, I think if you take alcohol, for example, and tobacco, which I don't class the same, I think that's sort of the extreme sin industry. I mean, I don't consider gambling to be a sin stock, but a lot of people are trying to attach it to tobacco in the anti-gambling area. So we need to be very careful as an industry how we approach that. And I think there are some very good examples in the alcohol industry that have been very successful in creating, a real understanding of the product. So if you take a company like Diageo, they score very well in terms of E&D things. I was reading some stuff from this company called Thomson One. They did some work with a company called Sustainalytics and on ESG ratings. And Diageo were really the poster child in terms of this changing the perception of people's thoughts with regards to all of that. They ticked all the boxes in terms of the green issues of environmental stuff, but they every part of the way they got a story and had an initiative, and they've been at this for a number of years now. So their multiples compared to something like tobacco are probably 3-4 times that, and that's a real sort of tangible example. It's not without the research isn't without its issues, but it's a good example of how you can move perception. And despite the fact people like Imperial Tobaccos and BAT have been doing lots of the same things, the multiples have not gone the same direction.
It's really interesting, the comparison between the tobacco industry and the alcohol industry, isn't it? Because one industry have managed to find a purpose, and you talk about the perception from the public, and I suppose purpose is really important to legitimize an industry. Whereas alcohol has found its purpose. It's a social. You have fun together. You go to the football game, have a beer, and enjoy the game a bit more. Whereas tobacco hasn't really found its place in society, or it hasn't really found a legitimate purpose to convince the public about. And how the regulators are treating these two industries is essentially tax the tobacco industry out of existence. Whereas the alcohol industry is obviously highly taxed in many jurisdictions, but clearly it is an industry that has a place in society, so to say. What do you think? Like, if you look at the gambling industry, is there a risk that we can turn out? Like, do we need to find a purpose as well in order to also kind of in the public's minds and hearts? Find a place there in order to be more ESG.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's everyone's hobby to criticize politicians with regards to virtually anything, but in particular gambling. But to be fair to the politicians, they can only react to what they're fed. And if they're fed things that are incorrect, then we have a responsibility as an industry to try and rectify that and actually give a true picture. And I think the only way we are going to be able to do that really is by the use of data and sharing that data. And, I mean, the issue is that all these operators don't want to share that data. But so they're all doing their own thing with regards to responsible gambling. Whereas, I think there needs to be some leadership shown that says, actually, we're going to make this open source, and we're prepared to take that step for the good of our company and the good of the industry. You used to have things, if you take the land-based industry in Las Vegas, for example, you had some really big egos over there. But if there was an issue of real substance, then quite often these dinosaurs of the land-based world would come together. And I think we need to see that in the iGaming world, because I don't think it's existed. And some
yeah, especially on the European side, right? Because the Americans, they have great representation. I mean, the American Gaming Association are doing a fantastic job over there to pull the industry together, right? And we have a lot of really good industry organizations in Europe, but there isn't really any force that unites the European industry. No. It's very strange to me when the companies are in the billions and billions that the Europeans have not been able to find common ground in order to push better industry.
I think one of the underlying reasons for that is they've still been able to have exponential growth over the last few years, and by company acquisition and various other things. I don't think there's pressure to bear. What's beginning to happen in the US, so are still pretty embryonic stages in terms of their ESG approach in iGaming in particular. I think what's beginning to happen there, it's become so populated and so competitive in a very short space of time, and will continue to do so, that there's going to be some event that triggers some cohesion somewhere down the line. There's going to have to be, I think, and that's probably the best bet of it happening in Europe by default.
Right. So Stephen, would you say that the primary, like if we look at it from a pure business point of view, the prime reason to be ESG friendly is financial reasons, especially if you're a publicly traded company? Obviously, investors are looking at your company, asking themselves if they can motivate investing in you from ESG point of view. I read somewhere that by 2025, like 1/3 of all asset under management will be included in ESG funds, essentially. So if you're not ESG friendly, you're losing out on potentially 1/3 of all assets under management globally. So like $35 trillion today, expected to be up to $50 trillion by 2025. Would you say that is that the primary reason from a pure business perspective, to be ESG friendly, is to basically is to make a case to the ESG funds?
I think that will continue to be the case. Gambling being partly outside with quite a number of private companies as opposed to public listed companies that don't necessarily have the same fund mix as many other FTSE 100, S&P 500 companies, etc., etc. I think it's slightly different, but the principle is the same. That yes, you need to have ESG running through the very core of the soul of the company, from the chair right down to the newest employee. Otherwise, it won't work, because it's the whole ecosystem that's going to require it. So if you look at the different stakeholders, you've got the customer base, you've got employees, you've got the capital markets, partners, suppliers, regulators. More and more, each one of these stakeholders will have an ESG requirement, and they won't all be the same. So, the regulators have already started that process. Capital markets have certainly already started that process. And you've had, I think McKinsey's were doing some research on that, saying very, very positive things about people that were following those principles, effectively achieving higher multiples and better scores in all these with the fund managers and everyone else. And if you weren't, then you could face things like higher cost of borrowing. You could also have higher turnover of staff and everything else. So I go back to what I said before about the principles of the younger people who are very prevalent in our industry compared to many other industries. They have a different approach, different view of environment and social issues and governance issues than others. So the pressure from within companies alone is going to be going to be severe in terms of the workforce, because they're going to want to work in an environment where they feel valued and that everyone else is valued in the same way.
Absolutely, it's a very good point. I think purpose, especially from the younger generation, seems to be a major driver in the way people make their careers these days. And I was thinking as well, Stephen. We sometimes I get the feeling that we are a little bit in a bubble in the iGaming world. We don't really communicate that much to other industries and to people outside of our industry. And so I was thinking, let's have a look at what other stigmatized industries are doing from ESG perspective. And so, for example, we as we said here, like 1/3 of all assets under management is within ESG funds, and obviously this is where all the trends are heading this direction. And in order to build a successful company in the future, it seems to be a prerequisite that you need to take the ESG question serious. And so I was looking at the quarterly report of Philip Morris, the tobacco company. And I was thinking, like, how do they approach the ESG question? Because now it's like a tobacco company, like, how are they going to justify themselves? And if you open the Philip Morris quarterly report, they will have as a mission statement that they are working towards a smoke-free future. Something that you would not expect from a tobacco company, perhaps. But it's really interesting because they are clearly understanding the importance of the ESG question, and they are trying to find an angle for themselves to justify their existence. And rather than focusing on becoming carbon neutral or whatnot, they understand that the fundamental issue with their company is that smoking is bad, right? So what they are trying to do instead is then to basically steer their products towards these non-combustible
vaping,
what's it called? Vapes, basically. Yeah, vaping, and that's kind of like that's how they justify their future. It's like, okay, we're gonna turn our like former smokers into vapors, basically, and that is much better for their health. I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I think
I think
the difference is that effectively vaping is a fundamentally different product to cigarette smoking as such. There are comparisons between the two, sure, the similarities, but I don't see how you can move gaming to different products. So the issue is that exactly. What can we do, and what we can do is get better and improve our approach to how we deal with responsible gambling and all the other stuff. So the other stuff in many ways is easier to do. The $64 million question is, how do you resolve the responsible gambling element? But lots of other stuff we've been doing, and many other companies have been doing before. So carbon emissions, diversity statements, modern slavery, all of that, in comparison, are easier than the governance elements of your business if you're in a gambling business. I mean, I think the two, it's interesting. I've just been writing a piece comparing land-based and iGaming companies. And one of the things I say in it is that, the iGaming companies will die a death based on the algorithm. They can't believe, the perception is they just can't understand that there could be a fault with the algorithm. Whereas the land-based companies say, when I look at someone, I can tell if they're a problem gambler or not. And both statements are incorrect, really. Neither are correct in either way. But I think it's a good example of just where the mentality of the different companies are in terms of that.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, you mentioned in the beginning of the recording here, Stephen, that kind of ESG can often be seen as a tick box from board level. Why is it, do you think, that with a few exceptions, we talked about Kindred and Entain, why is it that such a big part of the industry seems to just kind of brush aside the ESG
I think
question?
part of the issue, my own view, is part of the issue for the iGaming companies is they're still in many ways immature businesses. a lot of these companies, either whether whichever part of the ecosystem you're looking at, it's someone sat in their bedroom coding 24 hours a day and then falling asleep for a few hours and starting again. And this is how they've started off and grown the companies. And what happens is, I think they get to a certain level and they suddenly realize we need help. We don't know what to do. And what tends to happen is some of those fail, some of those get someone else involved, and they grow again. So what you've not had, particularly in terms of many iGaming companies, is they've been slow to react in terms of that sort of the softer parts of management, if you like, which is why they do rely on algorithms and things that they know and understand. The softer skills have not been prevalent in the company early enough, and so it's sort of, they're still quite immature from a management level on that basis. And this is how I pick up a lot of my work, because I've sort of, I've got the grey hair and everything. Yes. I've been around in a corporate environment. I've dealt with shareholders and analysts and all those things. These are all things they're really scared of and find really difficult to get into, and also to understand why some of these softer issues can't be dealt with necessarily just with, technology and stuff. You need to do other things as well. So that's one of my theories regarding it. And I think, if you look, certainly, so whilst there's a certain level of maturity that's been reached across Europe, I think the US is still quite an immature market, because it's all, a lot of the stuff that's happening there happened in Europe 10 to 15 years ago. And we see that time after time. So, which is why I think we'll see some sort of cohesive event in the future, because, it needs to happen somewhere down the line.
Right. The immaturity of the industry is keeping you busy, Stephen. I'm very happy to hear that. Good stuff. Final question for you here today, Stephen. Can you paint two pictures for us here today? So, what will the industry look like in 5 years' time in two different scenarios? Scenario one is the entire industry watches this podcast, becomes totally inspired, and dedicates themselves to solving the ESG question. What will the industry look like in 5 years' time if the industry unites towards an ESG solution? And scenario two is they watch the podcast still, maybe, and they don't agree with the opinion that the ESG is worth their while, and the industry slides away from the ESG question. What will the industry look like in 5 years' time?
Well, I think what you'll have is people doing some of each. You'll get a hybrid in reality, and I do think probably in 5 years that those that embrace ESG will have sustainable goals they go for and have a sustainable company because of that. They will get some investment, although I think the funds and others will still be reluctant because it's gambling. I don't think 5 years will be enough to change that perception, but I think but they will get some of the benefits that we spoke about. So they may get lower cost borrowing, they may get higher multiples. And at the end of the day, people who start off these companies have got the same aim in many ways. They want an exit somewhere down the line, and that may be another company buys them. It may be they take it private with other investors. They go public on the stock exchange. Various mechanisms for an earn-out, which is what many people want out of this, but also for their shareholders and their employees. That's an important thing. They will get better valuations and have more chance of doing a sale than others. I mean, I was involved in a thing with a private equity company a couple of years ago, and we were trying to find a solution to get the thing over the line to buying a company. I'll not say which company it was, but there'd been some regulatory settlement in the past and some grey market issues, and we just couldn't balance off the risk. So in the end, we walked away. And that's a consequence of not having everything in a row with regards the things you need to put in place from an ESG perspective in part. So I think there'll be more of that kind of thing for those companies that don't do that. I think one of the more disturbing things is that those that don't embrace ESG will go down more a grey or black market route, which is never great for the bona fide operators and industry out there.
Right, it's a good point there, perhaps to start closing off with today. But as you point out here, the ESG question is not only about the responsible gambling question, but it's also black versus gray versus white kind of strategy in terms of which markets you choose. Where many of the it almost feels like today that the industry is dividing a bit between certain operators are moving more towards white. You have operators like Kindred again committing themselves to take revenue only from regulated markets, but then you have a different part of the industry that is turning more towards the grey market. It almost feels like a turning point right now.
And I don't think it only applies to operators. I think you've got affiliates who are now thinking, well, we're now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We're listed in some cases. We need to really, toe the line, corporate line. And I think that's an important thing, as scale naturally brings a pressure to companies to start doing these things. Those that are willing to. So if you look at Ontario, if you search for best bonuses, they're all offshore sites, and you need to. Regulators also have a part to play in this in terms of not making it difficult for the non-bona fide operators, but also giving some leverage to stop the offshore play, to getting the balance right with the regulation.
Absolutely. Brilliant, Stephen. I think that's a great way to wrap it up today. Thank you so much for donating your time here. Very interesting insights on the ESG question, and I'm sure this is not
my pleasure, Pierre. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for today.